Okay. So, unlike Spanish America, where the king funded expeditions and all the loot went directly back to the crown, English colonization was a completely different beast driven by private enterprise and religious refugees. So, to make this work without going broke, the English perfected the ultimate financial cheat code in the form of a joint stock company. So, think of this like a 17th century Kickstarter or crowdfunding campaign where investors pooled together their cash by buying shares in a colonial project, which spread out the financial risk. So, if a colony failed or got wiped out, no single investor lost their entire fortune, but if they hit the jackpot, everyone shared in the payout. So, because these were private ventures rather than royal military contracts or outposts, English settlements developed in tightly packed, geographically concentrated communities all along the coast, and the English didn't encounter massive consolidated empires like the Aztecs or the Incas like the Spanish, but rather smaller, scattered indigenous settlements. And instead of blending cultures or creating a complex social hierarchy like the Spanish casta system, the English instead brought entire families over to build separate, isolated, European-style communities. And for the English government, these settlements served a dual economic purpose. They were designed to ship raw materials like timber, tobacco, and fur back to the mother country, while simultaneously acting as forced consumers who could only buy manufactured goods from England. Beyond raw profit, colonization solved a massive domestic social crisis that was happening back in England as well, thanks to the enclosure movement where wealthy landlords kicked poor peasant farmers off of public lands to raise lucrative sheep instead. English towns were suddenly flooded with desperate, unemployed refugees, and the English government saw North America as a convenient release valve for this overwhelming population problem. And the poor saw it as the ultimate open world survival game where they could finally own their own land. And the ultimate driving force behind English settlement wasn't just gold, it was the life-changing promise of land ownership and a completely fresh start. More time down? All right, so in the 15th and 16th centuries, European society operated like an unyielding social ladder with zero social mobility. Commoners submitted to priests, priests bowed to bishops, peasant farmers slaved away for feudal landlords, and nobles pledged loyalty to monarchs who claimed their absolute authority came directly from God himself. So if you were born a peasant, you died a peasant, and that completely was the end of the story. But England broke the mold with this feudal hierarchy through a unique centuries-old tradition of limited monarchy that completely flipped the script on royal power. This political game changer kicked off all the way back in 1215 with a document called the Magna Carta. Imagine a group of furious, armed nobles surrounding King John and forcing him to sign what was essentially the ultimate terms of service agreement. The Magna Carta established this radical idea. England would be governed by the rule of law, not the random whims of an absolute ruler, and in theory, no one, not even the king or queen, was above the law, and over time it evolved into a shared power dynamic between the crown and parliament, the national legislature for England. Parliament was split into two chambers, the House of Lords, and it was made up entirely of inherited nobility, and then the House of Commons, which was an elected position. Now here is where Parliament held the ultimate power up. They had absolute control over taxation in the country. If a British monarch wanted to wage a war, build a fleet, or throw a lavish royal banquet, they couldn't just seize the money, they had to ask Parliament nicely for a budget approval. Parliament's ability to approve or deny taxes meant that the crown had to constantly negotiate with them, giving elected and appointed officials leverage over the throne. So this balance of power wasn't just a quirky domestic policy, it shaped how English citizens viewed their rights in government, creating a political culture that English colonists would eventually pack up and ship directly across the Atlantic to the Americas. Now, when Queen Elizabeth I dies in 1603 without an heir, because remember, she was the Virgin Queen, she didn't marry, so she didn't have any children, her Scottish cousin took the throne as King James I, uniting England and Scotland under the banner of Great Britain. But James brought a massive ideological hot take with him as he believed in the divine right of kings, claiming his authority came directly from God and that he answered to no earthly power or law. This immediately put him at odds with the Puritans, the Protestant reformers who wanted to purify the Church of England of any and all remaining Catholic-style elements, rituals, vestments, and hierarchy. The Puritans wanted simple, self-governing local congregations focused strictly on following the teachings of the Bible, but James cracked down hard on them, forcing radical Puritans called separatists to flee the country as outlaws, the exact group we now know as the Pilgrims, who sailed to America. Things escalated from bad to catastrophic in 1625 when James's son Charles I inherits the throne and took the divine right ego trip to a whole new level, raising taxes without ever consulting Parliament and eventually dissolving the legislative body entirely for 11 years. Imagine an executive leader completely deleting the legislative branch like an administrator shutting down a server because they didn't like the chat log. Charles' biggest blunder, however, was when he tried to force Anglican prayer books onto Presbyterian Scotland, triggering an armed Scottish rebellion in 1638. And desperate for war funds, Charles had to recall Parliament in 1640, but Puritan-led lawmakers refused to hand over a single penny until he surrendered power. When Charles tried to arrest 5 members of Parliament by force in 1642, the English Civil War officially began, pitting the king's royalists against the parliamentarian Roundheads. Enter in Oliver Cromwell. He was a fierce Puritan military leader whose forces crushed the royalist army, captured King Charles, and put him on trial for treason against his own people. In 1649, Charles I was publicly beheaded, a shockwave moment in history that proved no monarch was untouchable. Cromwell took over while but instead of creating a free republic, he ruled as a strict military dictator, banning fun activities like theater, sports, and Christmas, while forcing many defeated royalists, nicknamed the Cavaliers, to flee directly to Virginia. After Cromwell dies, an exhausted England restored the monarchy in 1660 under Charles II, who wisely agreed to share power with Parliament. His brother James II took over in 1685 as an openly Catholic authoritarian who systematically ignored Parliament, and when James had a Catholic son in 1688, Protestant leaders panicked at the thought of a permanent Catholic dynasty in England once again. So they launched a quiet coup, inviting James's Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, to take the throne instead. William landed with an army, James panicked and fled to France, and this peaceful, bloodless overthrow becomes known as the Glorious Revolution. William and Mary signed the English Bill of Rights, permanently ending the divine right of kings in the country, and established the British monarchs could only rule with the consent of Parliament. Does anyone need more time with that slide? Good. So when Italian navigator John Cabot mapped eastern Canada for England in 1497, the English crown essentially ghosted the Americas for the next 80 years because Cabot found zero gold and no fast travel shortcut to Asia. But by the late 1500s, England was hit with massive structural changes that made crossing the Atlantic look like the ultimate fresh start. Beginning with Martin Luther shattering Catholic unity in 1517 with the Protestant Reformation, King Henry VIII breaking away from Rome, the Anglican Church being formed to annul his marriage, but because Anglicanism kept a lot of the Catholic rituals, a hardline group known as the Puritans tried to reform the church and purify it from all Catholic stuff. When King James I took the throne and refused to compromise, many Puritans decided it was time to change servers. At the same time, England was dealing with an economic crisis that felt like a real-life survival game. A massive population boom triggering high unemployment, lucrative oil trade leading landlords to kick farmers off of their land. English leaders suddenly saw North American colonies as the ultimate release valve for the jobless. So merchants invent those joint stock companies. Sir Walter Raleigh put this new business model to test by funding an expedition to Roanoke Island off of the coast of Northern Carolina in 1585 and again in 1587. Now, the first group of settlers panicked after a brutal winter and hitched a ride back to England, but the second group was led by John White, and they weren't exactly quite that lucky. So when White finally returned with supplies in 1590 after being delayed by the war with Spain, the entire colony had vanished into thin air like an abandoned lobby in Fortnite. The only trace left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post, leaving the lost colony as one of history's most haunting unsolved historical cold cases. So in 1606, James I issued a corporate charter to the Virginia Company, a joint stock corporation, where investors pooled their cash together And late that year, the company dispatched 3 small ships carrying 144 men across the Atlantic. After a very brutal ocean transit, 104 survivors navigated into the Chesapeake Bay in the spring of 1607. Sailing up a broad river they named the James River and building a fortified outpost called Jamestown. The reality on the ground felt less like a glorious empire builder and more like a brutally punishing open-world survival game akin to Rust, where every mechanic is stacked up against you. The settlers picked a marshy, mosquito-infested peninsula that lacked clean drinking water, leading to rampant dysentery and typhoid. And to make matters worse, many of the initial colonists were aristocratic gentlemen who were formed to perform any manual labor, choosing to hunt for gold instead of planting any crops. So by late 1607, a pragmatic military veteran named Captain John Smith took charge, enforcing a strict rule: he who shall not work shall not eat. Smith established crucial trade connections with the Powhatan Confederacy, swapping metal tools and beads for maize to keep the colony afloat. And despite Smith's hardline leadership, Jamestown descended into a true horror movie scenario in the winter of 1609-1610, historically remembered as the starving time, trapped inside their fort by hostile relations and freezing weather. Desperate settlers ate dogs, horses, their leather boots, and eventually resorted to some form of cannibalism. By spring, a shocking total of only 60 survivors remained out of hundreds, and just as the broken remnant was packing up to abandon the colony, 3 English supply ships carrying 150 new settlers and a new governor, Lord de la Warr, had arrived. They ordered people to turn around. He imposed harsh military discipline and stabilized the settlement just moments before total corporate bankruptcy. So even after surviving the starving time, Jamestown was a money-losing pit for the Virginia Company until a colonist named John Rolfe introduced a sweet South American strain of tobacco in 1614. The crop became an overnight sensation in Europe, selling for massive amounts of profit and giving the colony its very first economic gold mine. So to solve the major labor shortage needed to farm this cash crop, the Virginia Company introduced the headright system in 1618. This paid for anyone to come to Virginia to get 50 acres of land plus 50 additional acres for any servant that they brought along with them. That same historic year, the company allowed for settlers to elect representatives called burgesses, creating the House of Burgesses, the first elected legislative government in English America. And the year 1619 marked another massive turning point as a Dutch warship anchored in Jamestown and traded 20 captured African men for food supplies, and initially classified as indentured servants who could theoretically earn their freedom after working off their debt. These men arrived at a time when the legal framework was shifting, laying the tragic groundwork for the permanent hereditary racial slavery across the colonies. Now, Virginia's booming tobacco economy led to the aggressive expansion of territory captured, and it alarmed the Powhatan Confederacy. So in March 1622, they launched a devastating surprise attack, killing over 300 settlers, nearly a third of the English population in the colony. Horrified by this economic mismanagement and bloodshed, King James I revoked the Virginia Charter in 1624, officially turning it into a royal colony. And just north of Virginia, another distinct colonial experiment was taking shape based on faith rather than corporate profit, as George Calvert, known as Lord Baltimore, envisioned a safe haven for English Catholics who faced intense legal discrimination back home. And after Calvert died, King Charles I granted his son the proprietary charter in 1632 for a vast territory known as Maryland. As a proprietary colony, Lord Baltimore owned the land and had monarch-like authority over its government. And although created as a Catholic refuge, Protestant settlers quickly outnumbered the Catholic ones. So to prevent bloody religious warfare, they passed the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649, guaranteeing all Christians to be able to practice the faith how they pleased. So in early 17th century England, a radical faction of Puritans known as Separatists decided that the state-run Anglican Church was far too corrupt to be saved. So they broke away completely to form illegal self-governing congregations. Now, facing intense religious persecution, a group of them fled to the Netherlands in 1608, and by 1620, worried their children were losing their English identity. These separatists, who we now call the Pilgrims, decided to hit the ultimate reset button and build a brand new society all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Joining forces with other non-separatist settlers, 102 passengers loaded onto the Mayflower in September of 1620, aiming for the warm, established lands of Virginia. However, after a brutal ocean crossing that felt like a chaotic survival mission in Valheim, severe Atlantic storms blew them completely and totally off course, and instead of Virginia, they dropped anchor in November off the freezing coast of modern-day Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Realistically, realizing that they were outside the legal jurisdiction of their royal patent, a bit like landing outside the playable map boundary, the settlers faced potential mutiny from the non-separatist passengers. So to prevent total anarchy, 41 adult men gathered in the ship's cabin to sign the Mayflower Compact, which was a civil covenant establishing a basic framework for representative self-government based on majority rule. They eventually rowed ashore to establish Plymouth Colony, but their immediate reward was a soul-crushing winter. A devastating epidemic swept through the settlement, leaving about 50 people by the spring of 1621. And Plymouth likely would have become another abandoned side quest if not for the arrival of Squanto, a Wampanoag man who spoke multiple languages, and he served as a crucial diplomat and survival instructor, teaching the weakened English settlers how to fertilize native corn using fish remains and navigate local waterways. So by the autumn of 1621, after harvesting their first successful crop, the Pilgrims and around 90 Wampanoag warriors gathered for a 3-day harvest festival of hunting, gaming, and diplomacy, as this historic alliance and feast became the enduring cultural inspiration for the modern holiday of Thanksgiving. When King Charles I ascended to the throne in 1625, he cranks up the pressure on religious dissenters, making life miserable for the Puritans who wanted to reform the Anglican Church. So to make matters worse, a severe economic depression hits England's wool industry, causing massive unemployment in Puritan towns. So we get a wealthy lawyer named John Winthrop, who helped pull off a brilliant maneuver. He and his fellow Puritans and investors used their corporate business charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company. So they established an independent, self-governing colony in New England, far away from the king's immediate control. And in 1630, Winthrop himself led a group of 11 ships for the colony. During the voyage aboard the flagship Arabella, Winthrop delivered a legendary sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity, where he famously declared that their new colony would be like a city set upon a hill, a beacon of moral purity that the entire world would be watching. This marked the start of the Great Migration, an influx that brought over 20,000 English Puritans to Massachusetts Bay Colony. Eventually, of course, they'll drop the Massachusetts Bay, or the Bay Colony part of it, and just be called Massachusetts, which is much simpler, I suppose. But the company charter formed the basis of their government, establishing a general court and an assembly that elected Winthrop as governor. And while the Puritans wanted to keep church leadership separate from official offices, their society was anything but open-minded. Anyone who spoke out against Puritan theology was branded a heretic in general. And so some of those outcasts that were kind of banned from the colony would end up forming Rhode Island and Connecticut. So if we were to answer this question here, we might say something along the lines of religious groups such as the Puritans and Separatists settled in New England to escape persecution, leading to tightly knit theocratic communities that emphasized religious conformity and communal values. And in contrast, economic opportunities drove colonization in regions like Virginia, where the pursuit of profit and land ownership resulted in plantation-based economics and social hierarchies dependent on indentured servitude and later slavery. Meanwhile, Maryland was founded as a Catholic haven, but developed religious tensions due to Protestant immigration, leading to laws like the Toleration Act of 1649. And this diversity in motivations led to distinct regional cultures and governance structures in the American colonies. So in 1631, a fiery minister by the name of Roger Williams landed in Massachusetts Bay and immediately started dropping truth bombs that horrified Puritan authorities. Williams argued that the Puritans were compromising their faith by staying tied to the Church of England, and he took an even more radical stance by declaring the king had zero legal right to give away Native American lands. The Massachusetts General Court tried to deport him back to England in 1636, but he pulled off a high-stakes escape in a snowy southern wilderness as he bought land directly from the Narragansett Indians and founded Providence, which became an unprecedented experiment in total religious liberty where civil government had no authority over spiritual matters, functioning basically like a neutral safety net where players with different builds could all coexist. At the exact same time, a brilliant Puritan woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson began holding popular home Bible studies, and that challenged the authority of mainstream Boston ministers, arguing that salvation came from divine grace and not good works, causing such a massive ideological uproar that the General Court tried her for heresy and banished her in 1637. She and her supporters headed south to found Portsmouth, Rhode Island, and as Massachusetts continued to banish ideological dissenters, additional outcasts formed Newport and Warwick. Eventually, these towns joined together to form the colony of Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations, officially enshrining complete religious freedom into their charter. Meanwhile, another prominent leader was growing tired of Boston's rigid political setup. Reverend Thomas Hooker secured permission from the General Court to lead his congregation to the Connecticut River Valley, founding Hartford, and he believed that government authority should stem from the consent of the governed rather than by their church membership. So following the brutal Pequot War of 1637, New England experienced a fragile 30-year period of peace where cross-cultural trade flourished. By the 1670s, the economic foundation of that peace completely collapses as the beaver fur trade was drying up and the colonial governments began aggressively expanding their borders while trying to force sovereign native nations to submit to English laws, courts, and social customs. So the boiling point arrives in 1675 when Plymouth Colony arrested, tried, and executed 3 Wampanoag men for the murder of a Christianized native informant. And this unilateral act of legal overreach triggered a massive, devastating war led by the Wampanoag sachem Metacomet, whom the colonists referred to as King Philip. He formed a powerful intertribal alliance that hit English towns with devastating guerrilla tactics, burning dozens of settlements to the ground along the New England frontier back to the coast, and the conflict rapidly devolved into a total war scenario with shocking brutality. In 1676, colonial forces managed to track down and kill Metacomet, and in a terrifying display of military intimidation, they decapitated him, mounted his head on a pike, and displayed it publicly in Plymouth for over 2 decades as a warning sign to any future resistance. By the time the war formally ended in 1678, the cost was catastrophic. English settlements had been crippled, and the sovereign Native American presence in the coastal New England was almost entirely shattered. So, in 1642, King Charles I took his autocratic ego trip a little bit too far. He marched on Parliament. We kind of already talked about that for the most part. So, in the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic established New Netherland, centered around the valuable fur trading post of New Amsterdam. And to boost their sluggish population, the Dutch opened their doors to virtually anyone willing to buy land, turning the settlements into a very diverse, multi-ethnic hub of over 10,000 residents by 1664. But England viewed this prosperous Dutch territory right in the middle of their Atlantic colonies like a competitor stealing their server bandwidth in an online game. In 1664, King Charles II decided to eliminate the competition, and he granted the entire Dutch territory to his brother James, the Duke of York, and the Dutch governor surrendered without firing a single cannon. The Duke of York promptly renamed the entire territory New York, as you might know. To manage his vast new territory, the Duke granted the land between Delaware Bay and Connecticut River to 2 loyal friends and created New Jersey to lure settlers away from the older colonies. New Jersey's proprietors offered generous land grants, guaranteed religious freedom, and the right to form an elective legislative assembly, rapidly transforming the region into a thriving colonial haven. And then in 1681, King Charles II found himself owing a massive financial debt to the deceased Admiral William Penn, and to settle that, he gave a vast tract of land to his son, William Penn Jr., who was a devout Quaker, a radical Protestant group formerly known as the Society of Friends. They were heavily persecuted in England because they were strict pacifists, refusing to bow to royalty, championed total religious toleration, and rejected traditional church hierarchies and paid ministers. Penn viewed his new colony, Pennsylvania, as a holy experiment, a sanctuary where people of all faiths could live together peacefully under democratic principles, and unlike many of the other colonial leaders, Penn insisted on treating Native Americans fairly, negotiating the land purchase with them directly rather than seizing the territory by force. He named his capital Philadelphia, translating to City of Brotherly Love, and Penn's vision was an instant success. By 1684, over 7,000 settlers lived there. So back in 1663, freshly restored King Charles II wanted to expand English territory south of Virginia, aggressively crowding the space towards Spanish-held Florida. So to repay political debts, he handed a huge plot of land to 8 wealthy noblemen called the Lord Proprietors and named the territory Carolina after himself. The very first permanent English settlement dropped anchor at Charlestown what we know today as Charleston, South Carolina. Even though Carolina didn't officially split into two separate colonies until 1729, it developed two completely different personalities almost right out of the gate. In North Carolina, the vibe was rural, quiet, and decentralized. It was populated largely by former indentured servants and small-scale farmers who migrated down from Virginia, focusing on growing tobacco as their primary cash crop and operating like an indie survival game where everyone manages their own modest farm setup. But down in the South, settlers had wild ambitions for building massive high-profit plantations. Initially, they try out sugarcane. That does not go terribly well. And eventually, they end up growing rice. Rice ends up growing fairly well there. Very high stakes trade network was built to kind of maximize profits. And then in 1729, they're split officially into North and South Carolina. In the 1720s, a member of the British Parliament named James Oglethorpe was appalled to find that many of the imprisoned people in England were debtors, not strictly criminals. And as a result of that, he came to the king asking for a colony where the poor could start over. So in 1732, George made Oglethorpe and 19 others the trustees for the territory between the Savannah and Altamaha rivers and named the area Georgia in honor of the king. They arrived in 1733. The experiment lasted for about 19 years before eventually being named a royal colony. So by 1676, the Virginia colony was behaving like a completely broken open-world RPG server where a handful of max-level players hogged all the best resources while everyone else was left to starve. Wealthy planters, known as the Tidewater elite, had claimed all the fertile land along the coast, forcing newly freed indentured servants into the dangerous inland frontier just to find a plot of their own land. Nearly a quarter of free white men in Virginia were completely landless, squeezed by tanking tobacco prices, sky-high taxes, and zero political power. So the entire region was a total powder keg waiting for a single spark, and that spark ignited when a land dispute between a frontier planter and local Native Americans on the Potomac River left a herdsman dead. Now, frontier settlers retaliated by killing roughly 24 Native Americans, triggering a brutal cycle of revenge that swept south to the James River, where raiders killed the farm manager of a wealthy, troublemaking newcomer named Nathaniel Bacon. When Governor William Berkeley refused to send military support, prioritizing his lucrative personal deerskin trade with the local tribe, instead, Bacon snaps. Positioned like an anti-hero who recruits every rogue faction on the map, he organizes a ragtag army of landless settlers, small farmers, and even enslaved Africans, vowing to eliminate all Native Americans regardless of whether they were peaceful allies or not. Berkeley declared Bacon an outlaw and challenged him to a duel, and Bacon declined, plunging the colony into an all-out civil war. Bacon's forces launched violent attacks against local tribes and issued the Declaration of the People, publicly accusing the governor of massive corruption. And when Berkeley's loyalist troops put up almost no resistance, Bacon's men torched the capital city of Jamestown to the ground. But just as Bacon seemed poised to take complete control of Virginia, he caught a fatal case of dysentery and died in a tent, causing his entire rebellion to collapse. 23 of Bacon's top followers were hanged. It horrified King Charles II, who recalled Berkeley to England in disgrace. And though the rebellion failed, Virginia's terrified elites realized that poor white and black laborers uniting was their ultimate nightmare scenario. So, just like the settlers down in Virginia, many New England Puritans viewed indigenous people through an extremely biased, hostile lens, framing them as dangerous threats who had zero legal or moral claim to the land. When an English trader was found dead in 1636 and the crime was blamed on the Pequot people, Puritan authorities in Massachusetts didn't look for a single suspect. They just went full nuclear operation and launched a brutal revenge campaign by burning an entire Pequot village to the ground. As men, women, and children tried to escape the inferno, they shot them down, escalating a local feud into a horrific Pequot War, which lasted from 1636 to 1637. It was a nightmare scenario playing out like a dark fantasy war film where an unstoppable, heavily armored faction completely wipes off a rival group from the map. Plymouth Governor William Bradford openly admitted that watching the people frying in fire was a fearful sight, but in the ultimate display of cold-hearted religious justification, he claimed that the bloody victory was a sweet sacrifice provided by God. In response, the Pequot leader Sassacus rallied the survivors to launch a desperate counterattack to defend their homeland, but the odds were stacked against them. Despite all of this, the conflict formally ended with the Treaty of Hartford in 1638, where a brutal legal document officially declared the Pequot Nation to be dissolved. So if we were to answer this question, we might say that the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, adopted in 1639, was one of the first written constitutions in the American colonies, allowing all adult men to vote. It marked a shift from Massachusetts' more restricted political system where only church members could vote. Reverend Thomas Hooker played a crucial role in drafting these orders, reflecting a more democratic approach to governance. So, in the 17th century, the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland experienced a massive labor-intensive boom in labor-intensive crops like tobacco. So planters desperately needed strong, able-bodied workers, what they literally described in primary sources as lusty laboring men capable of enduring the brutal heat and backbreaking field labor. And to meet that demand, colonial landowners relied heavily on indentured servants drawn from England, Ireland, Scotland, and continental Europe. The term indentured comes from the physical paper contract, which had notched or indented edges cut into it so both parties could prove the document's authenticity. In exchange for transatlantic passage, food, and basic shelter, the individuals basically signed a contract from 3 to 7 years. A lot of homeless in London were actually kidnapped and sold into indentured servitude in America. Parliament declared that convicts could actually avoid their prison sentence or hanging by relocating to the colonies and becoming indentured servants. So once there, they had food and beds, but the limited rights weren't treated very well. They couldn't own their own property, engage in trade, couldn't marry without permission. They could be whipped. They could have their service period extended for disobeying rules and orders. So once freed, they could claim freedom dues set by custom and law. There was a little bit of money, some tools, maybe some land, clothing, food, that type of thing. So it was pretty often that they actually got their time period extended. All right, so by 1700, enslaved Africans resided within every British mainland colony, comprising 11% of the total colonial population. Yet structural economic divergences dictated distinct labor regimes. So in the non-plantation North, New England's enslaved population hovered around 2%, practicing family slavery where captives resided within small merchant or yeoman households, and conversely, the Chesapeake and Low Country regions developed plantation-scale chattel systems. So by 1730, the Chesapeake achieved self-sustaining natural population growth, an unprecedented demographic milestone in the Western Hemisphere, and by 1750, 80% of its enslaved labor force was native-born. This domestic expansion sat atop the transatlantic slave trade, a forced migration exceeding 10 million individuals, as captives represented diverse West and Central African polities encompassing 50 distinct languages and varied religious traditions. African coastal traders funneled war captives to European fortresses where merchants branded, bonded, and loaded them onto vessels for the Middle Passage, the terror-filled maritime leg of the mercantilist triangular trade network. And conditions during the transatlantic crossing were devastating, as ship captains implemented tight packing protocols, confining captives in filthy, unventilated holds for weeks, with brief periods above deck for forced exercise. Mortality rates averaged about 16% due to dysentery, malnutrition, and psychological despair, triggering frequent shipboard rebellions. Of the 12.5 million total embarkations, Brazil absorbed nearly 50%, while Jamaica received over 1 million, dwarfing the volume imported into North America. European operators codified this trade through radicalized legal doctrines, reducing human beings to common chattel. And on southern plantations, overseers deployed gang labor systems and institutionalized physical violence such as whipping, mutilation, and sale to Caribbean sugar plantations to maintain labor discipline and enforce complete subjugation. So while mainstream history often focuses on mass armed uprisings, enslaved Africans in colonial America engaged in daily acts of covert defiance that functioned much like a quiet sabotage campaign in a stealth game like Metal Gear Solid. So captives pushed back against their bondage by intentionally slowing down field labor, damaging cash crops, breaking essential farm tools, feigning illness, or fleeing into surrounding swamps. The personal stakes, however, were unfathomably high as overseas and local slave catchers tracked escapees with brutal efficiency, and capture meant terrifying physical retaliation ranging from severe public whippings and hot iron branding and horrific surgical mutilations, like severing the Achilles tendon to prevent future escape attempts. Yet, despite this campaign of total control, enslaved people pulled off remarkable feats of cultural survival, fusing together Western African traditions into a resilient, unified African American identity. Strip away your current vocabulary for a second, and you'll find the heritage hidden in plain sight within the modern English language. Everyday terms like goober for peanut, yam, tote, banana trace their linguistic roots directly back to West African languages, while regional waterways like South Carolina's Kusawhiti and Wando rivers preserve original indigenous and African naming conventions. Even more profoundly, enslaved communities revolutionized American music, oral storytelling, and spiritual life. By blending together traditional African spiritual practices with Protestant Christianity, they developed a vibrant, distinct religious culture centered around the concept of divine deliverance, the unwavering belief that God would ultimately liberate them, just as he had the Israelites to the Promised Land, and their spiritual songs function like encrypted audio logs in an action-adventure game. On the surface, they sounded like innocent Christian hymns to white overseers, but underneath, they contained coded messages, secretly mapping out instructions and psychological signals designed to coordinate underground escape efforts and keep the spirits of resistance alive.